This is Criteria. Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. I'm here with my co-host, Thomas V. Miras. Hey, Thomas.
Hello.
Happy New Year to you.
And
it's
to you.
The first time that we're shooting an episode here in the new year.
Mm-hmm.
Happy New Year to all of our listeners, and Happy New Year to our guest, a returning guest here. We've got Timothy Reckart, an animation director and a friend. Last time you were here talking with us about Fantasia.
Right.
And today we're talking about something I guess exists on a spectrum with Fantasia. Huh?
We're recording this on January 6th, the solemnity of the Epiphany.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a road story. And today we're discussing a road movie, you know, so there's some connection there at the very least.
For anyone who hasn't seen the title of this podcast episode, we are talking about
I had a baby brother. I had a little baby brother. And he was perfect. Perfect everywhere.
none other than Mad Max Fury Road. I think, Tim, you described this as the greatest Catholic film.
The greatest, maybe greatest Catholic action film ever made. And this, I just want to throw in that this was my request because it's like maybe my favorite movie ever, certainly my favorite action movie ever. And I think there's so much that could be said about it that we're not even going to be able to scratch the surface in this podcast.
Totally.
But yeah,
Totally. Well, we were both really excited when you mentioned this film because we've been talking about doing Mad Max for a long time. This movie is a favorite of both me and Thomas. Mm-hmm. But really all the Mad Max films I enjoy to greater or lesser degrees. For anybody who hasn't listened to that Fantasia episode, you should definitely check it out because you were one of our best guests. We really enjoyed doing that episode. And so, yeah, we really jumped at the opportunity to get you back on here in person this time. You're usually out on the West Coast.
Yeah, I happen to be out for Christmas and New Year's in New York. So I thought, let's knock one out, especially if it could be Mad Max.
Totally.
Know, so, yeah.
And for everybody listening, we actually just finished watching the film again just moments ago. So I'm like totally amped to get into this conversation.
Right.
But yeah, Thomas, is there anything you want to say by way of introduction or?
I've got high octane crazy blood filling me up.
Well, Thomas, you just recently finished watching the sort of oeuvre of Mad Max films.
Yeah,
right?
I need to go back and watch the Babe films next because the same director, George Miller, of course. I think that this is true for a lot of people. My first Mad Max film was seeing Mad Max Fury Road in the theater. And I only later in the past like year or 2 years have started watching the earlier three, and starring Mel Gibson, of course, the first three. And I think that I just watched the third one, Beyond Thunderdome, over Christmas, and having seen the first three only once each, my tentative conclusion is that each film is better than the previous one.
Does put you in a minority.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of Thunderdome.
Yeah.
That's true, but Roger
Ebert
Ebert gave it 4 stars, so, you know.
Yeah, okay.
Well, Tim, what was your introduction to the Mad Max universe?
It's the same as you, Thomas, and I wonder, James, is it the same for you? Had you seen any of them before?
The first one I watched was Road Warrior.
Oh, yeah?
So I watched Road Warrior first.
Like when?
Like when I was 16 or something.
Yeah.
Is that the second one?
Yeah. So I watched the second one, then I watched the third one, then I went back and watched the first one.
Right.
And then, of course, like 10 years later, Fury Road came out.
Right.
And I will say that Road Warrior is probably my favorite. It's probably a little bit of sentimental association for me as being like the first introduction, but I also think that there's like a purity to Road Warrior that I appreciate. Mm-hmm. It's like it's so like distilled what it is, you know, whereas Thunderdome begins to like veer off into like much more of this world building and sort of like fanciful elements that
There is something very basic about the first two.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I will say that world building and fantasy-esque element is present from the beginning. The first one is probably my least favorite for the reason that it's like kind of bewildering at first. You don't really sure what to make of this movie, and it's the one I'm most hesitant to recommend for a few reasons. One of which is like it's also the most graphic in terms of like some sexual stuff and nudity and things. But I will say that I think that there's a through line that exists through all of these films that's super clear. It's one of the things that's most impressive to me about Fury Road is that, when this film came out, I'd been a fan of Mad Max for a long time. I'd been introduced to it by my older brother as kind of like this obscure post-apocalyptic action film. When it was being reboot, I thought like that this was going to go the way of so many reboots, just sort of like capitalizing on past success and really spoiling a perfectly good franchise that was left well enough alone.
Right.
But I was very pleased to find out that, to the contrary, this film is great. It stands on its own, in some respects over and above the previous three. But even more importantly, it really like stays true to the spirit of the first three films, and you can see George Miller really developing and deepening an aesthetic and a thematic concern that a lot of the threads that you can detect him like beginning to pull on in the very first film, they really like come to like full fruition in Fury Road, I think.
And it's interesting. I mean, you were saying it's a reboot, but to be fair, I don't know what year the third one came out, sometime in the 80s, right?
Yeah.
But this movie was in
very much
sometime in the 80s. Right. They were trying to make this film for 20 years before it actually got made. The film came out in 2015, Mad Max Fury Road, and so the actual timeline of when George Miller started thinking about this story was much closer to the much more continuous, right, with the original.
There could have been a world where like Mel Gibson was Max in this movie.
He could have been possibly if circumstances had not perhaps conspired. But
that's true.
I think it's one of the things that immediately won me over the first time I saw it, because I went in there thinking, how are they going to handle the fact that like we know Mel Gibson is Max,
right.
And just right at the beginning it says Tom Hardy as Max Rockatansky. Right. It's just like you're at the theater and there is an actor playing this part, and it's not it sort of suddenly becomes like a role like 007 or Batman. It's just like it's played by an actor.
Totally. And this is something that we've talked about on the podcast before about like this problem of recasting actors or getting their likeness or whatever. And I think that it's like a real disservice to like the acting craft, but also to audiences like ability to accept the like a new incarnation of like a familiar character. And Tom Hardy is so great as Mad Max in this. I think that not only does he just come across as like a sort of like worthy heir apparent after Mel Gibson. And one of the things I love about Mel Gibson so much is like this masculinity that he exudes. And I think Tom Hardy has got that in spades. But also Tom Hardy brings something singular to the role, and I think it's like what people most readily associate with Tom Hardy, which is like this sort of oddness, you know? And it's an odd film. It's an odd series of films. It's an odd universe. And so it's very apt that Tom Hardy like bring this hardiness to the role,
Yeah, I agree. I don't know what you guys think, but if I had to point like to a difference tonally between this movie and the previous three, it would be that there's something of a childlike spirit in the first three that I think this maybe is a little. They're all dark in their own way, but I think this one, I don't want to say it's not cartoony. I mean, the look has a very comic book look, but there is something cartoony in certain characters in some of the earlier movies, or maybe the third one in particular, that is not in the same way in this. Does that make any sense to you?
When you say that, it makes me think of that like rotocopter guy from the second movie, the gyrocopter. And there is something kind of dorky in that. I don't really believe that, but I'll go with it because it's kind of fun. And this movie, to me, feels totally believable. and yet is still super playful.
Yes.
Obviously,
Yes.
because it has a flame-throwing electric guitar in it, you know?
Yes, and I wonder if like part of that is too that like the it's maybe we don't think about it as much because this movie is so fast paced through almost the entire film. You know, like in three, my favorite act of Mad Max 3 is the second act where he's with the children and like and it's cool, but it's slightly cheesy and Ewok-y at the same time, but I really liked it. I found it very affecting. But when you stop and you're dealing with these people and you're having dialogue, normal conversations instead of sort of like one line shouted that just sort of like sticks in your head, you know, it can come off a little more cartoony or something. I don't know if that's part of it, but
so I want to ask a question. Did you recommend that after you saw this movie? I'll say when I saw this movie, it blew my mind.
Yes,
like
totally.
I came out of that movie actually thinking I was not going to like. I went to a pre-screening like a week and a half before this movie was released. I went and saw it because a friend of mine was an employee at Warner Brothers. He said, "You want to come see a movie?" And I went for the free wine and cheese. And my wife and I had actually seen the trailer for Mad Max and said, "Well, we don't need to see that," because it looked like you say like just a dumb reboot. Like, okay, whatever, a bunch of explosions. Seen it. So I went for the free wine and cheese. And when we came out, the other two guys I'd been with were kind of talking about what they'd liked, and I like was mute. And they said, "Well, Tim, what did you think?" And I was like, I think I loved it.
Wow.
And it was still kind of falling into place. And then I had this week and a half where like no one in the world, I kept every morning I woke up and Googled, is anyone talking about this movie yet? Because no one had seen it yet. And I felt like is it Cassandra who can see the future, but like no one believes her? And I was like,
except the future is good in this
right.
case.
It's like no one's talking about it. And I've seen like the future of movies or something, of some new revelation. And so when it finally came out, I was like the most evangelical like preacher on this movie. To everyone in my family was required to go. And the interesting thing I noticed was that everyone who had seen The Road Warrior came away like, what was that? Like all my aunts, my uncles, my dad, my mom, they were like, that movie like had no story. It was just a bunch of explosions. And everyone seemingly like younger than 40 got the movie. So I think part of it was like a lot of us, like you and me, Thomas, who had never seen a Mad Max movie, like we had never seen a movie like this. We're like because what's different here is most action movies, there's dialogue and then there's an action sequence during which the story basically stops and you watch the action happen. And then action is resolved. The story continues a little bit and sets you up for the next action set piece. But the thing that's different here is that there is no storytelling outside of the action. The action is the storytelling.
Yes.
And that's what's
one of the most impressive aspects of it. You know, I think the only film, my favorite of the first three is Beyond Thunderdome. And it's the only one that I would really, granted I've only seen them once each, but it's the only one that I would really put up against Fury Road, not in every respect, but in certain respects in terms of world building and connecting with it emotionally. And a lot of that is because Beyond Thunderdome takes its time with the world building. I mean, we've got this very like Tatooine, Mos Eisley kind of opening with the Barter Town, and then we've got this whole other setting that we take a long time introducing. But then, so in a sense, it's understandable if that movie takes more time on the world building, but it also highlights, making that comparison also highlights like what's so impressive about Fury Road is how much of that it manages to get in so very efficiently, and it totally just drops you right in.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like it's all by implication. I think that everything you're describing makes Thunderdome a more conventional science fiction action movie.
Totally. Like a Planet of the Apes or something like that.
Whereas when I finally went back and watched them all, I thought Road Warrior had the spare like starkness in terms of like there's just not much there. And what's done is kind of done through the action. That Fury, it feels to me like actually Road Warrior is like the low budget version of Fury Road.
Yeah, well, that was one of the things I was trying to get at in describing Road Warrior as like a sort of distilled experience.
Right.
I think that one of the things that I liked about it when I first encountered it was this sense of mystery around elements of the world that weren't explained, that were just sort of taken for granted. And that's also present here in Fury Road. Yeah. But when I watched Fury Road for the first time, I also, though I enjoyed it, and like was pleasantly surprised to have enjoyed it, I don't think I appreciated what it was at the time, because I think I sort of was importing my expectations based on what I had seen of past Mad Max films. And that on repeated viewings, it really began to like sort of solidify in my mind, like, oh my gosh, this is really a work of genius. This is like a masterpiece.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I was getting at with the mentioning my uncles, aunts, and all the other Philistines in my family who didn't get this movie, because they saw it and they didn't like it, and it actually, I think that was really valuable and maybe the biggest contribution to my love for this movie, because I kept seeing the movie, and the challenge was how to explain what they're missing, like what they're, and part of it was what I just said about, like, it's telling story through the action. I've never seen a film that does that before.
Yeah.
And my other favorite action movies are all the Mission Impossible movies, and they very much, in fact, they shoot their set pieces before they've written their script, because it's so much built that way of, like, action scene, dialogue. But this, obviously, totally different. But then as I kept evangelizing this movie, I started doing what you're talking about, just digging deeper and realizing, like, there is so much richness here. And that, for those of you out there who are wondering why is this supposedly the greatest Catholic action film ever made, I think this movie maps beautifully, like the themes of this movie map beautifully onto John Paul II's Theology of the Body. And I think all of the thematic concerns here are the exact same things that John Paul was talking about with his philosophy of personalism and his book Love and Responsibility, Theology of the Body. All of that teaching from the Pope. This is the movie that dramatizes it, I think.
Wow. Well, that's awesome. I think that maybe now is a good time to maybe just give a quick synopsis about what this film is actually about.
Right.
Now that we've drawn all of you Catholic listeners in. So Mad Max is about Max. He's sort of a police officer. When we first encounter him in the first film, he's the world is like already crumbling. It's not clear that it's totally post-apocalyptic yet, but society is falling apart, and he's kind of one of the last representatives of law and order in this lawless world. And each film kind of exists as let me say that again. Each film exists as a sort of standalone adventure that Max goes on through this world that is progressively more and more apocalyptic and progressively more and more I don't want to say lawless, because we actually see like a kind of society begin to rebound in Fury Road. I guess I'll just cut to the chase and say that Fury Road, we find a Max who's very decrepit, very sort of like at his wit's end. As he says, he's running from the living and the dead. He's haunted by all of the experiences of the previous films and the in-between. And he comes across a kind of post-apocalyptic society that is governed by this tyrannical warlord. And well, I don't know. Where else do I go? What else do I say about this? Well, I think
now you have to bring in Furiosa, who so Max is captured by these bad guys, and so that's where we leave him. And now we meet Furiosa, who works for the big bad, but she has decided that this is her moment to save the wives of Immortan Joe, the warlord, and so she has smuggled them into her war rig, and she's going to just take them off to reach this green place, the paradise that she knows is somewhere beyond the horizon. And so the story is about how her plan doesn't go exactly as she hoped, but luckily there's Max, the thing she never accounted for, and Max in his own way didn't expect to ever meet Furiosa, but these two characters who at the beginning are trying to kill each other,
I know,
by the end they are saving each other's lives.
Yeah.
And so it's for anyone who thinks the movie doesn't have a story, just look at that. If that's where we're starting and that's where we're ending, and you do it without dialogue, that is a real, that's a story.
It's really interesting what you mentioned about Furiosa and Max both attempting to kill each other at the beginning, because there's actually a third main character in this film, Hux? Nux. So he's one of the sort of...
Hux is from Disney Star Wars.
Whoops.
Please never do an episode on that.
Well, Nux is a sort of unwitting pawn of this warlord. He's what's known as a war boy, and these are boys who are sort of bred to make war, to drive these insane, tricked out desert war vehicles, he sort of emerges as one of our unlikely heroes as well. And so it's really these three who become the sort of central focus of a film, although its titular character, Mad Max, is, supposedly the main character. He actually gets probably the fewest lines of dialogue and probably about equal screen time that, at least to Charlize Theron, who plays Furiosa. Right. So
it does really feel like Furiosa's story that Max wanders into.
Yes.
Right.
And the reason I bring up Nux as well is because he also is sort of in this weird relationship at the beginning, this ambiguous relationship of at times wanting to kill a character and other at times saving them.
Right.
So this something that George Miller crafts for us in the first half hour of this film is this really complicated sort of network of relationships among these three characters where at any given moment they're either trying to protect one another or kill one another. So if Nux is, about to like fill his car with gasoline and throw a flare in to like blow up Furiosa, Max is trying to stop him and wrest the flare out of his hands. And then the next moment, if Max is trying to like blast off Nux's hand because he's shackled to him, so that he can get free of Nux. Well, later he and Nux are together battling Furiosa, who's trying to take out Max. So it's this really fascinating, almost like comment on the sort of state of the world in which these characters exist, where people who really need each other, who really end up saving each other, are just through no fault of their own, really pitted against each other.
Right.
This is the world that
you're right.
that
And those alliances are very ad hoc. It's like, I, Max, want to GTFO. I want to survive. I want that car. If you're the one who's going to help me get there, then you're my friend right now. But it's not because you and me have anything. It's because I need you for this thing that I want.
It's kind of like in Beyond Thunderdome with Master, with Master Blaster, and then Master ends up going off. They end up taking Master away with them,
Right.
But yeah, to your point about these being sort of the three main characters, these are the three main characters who all have the redemption arc. This movie is in the slow act of this movie, we're explicitly pointed to, hope and redemption as sort of the themes of the characters. And so, Nux, along with Max and Furiosa, each of them is in their own way seeking a redemption, or at least seeking hope. In the case of Nux, it's particularly just something great to do.
Nux's journey is moving from this, the true believer in Immortan Joe's whole system, which is that the best a war boy can hope for is basically self-immolation in the service of Immortan Joe's war. He becomes disillusioned through his own failure and realizes ultimately that actually that wasn't the great thing that he thought it was. And then so but like you say, he's searching for, I want to live for something greater than myself. And eventually decides that Furiosa's mission is that thing.
Yes. And the thing with Nux too is that he is dying from the beginning. He's half-life. I don't know what exactly it is. He's got these weird, growths that are eating at his windpipe. And so he's what I like about his character is that he puts to use that mindset for good ultimately, which before he was putting to use just for sort of meaningless glory in battle, or according to his, his worldview, where there's this religion that they've sort of built up about, what will happen to you if you go to Valhalla, if you die fighting for Immortan Joe. Right. And he's still trained that way. He still has that mindset, that sort of kamikaze, comic crazy, as they call it, mindset, but he ends up putting it to use. So, we even find some good in a twisted form in the ideals of the society that Immortan Joe has built.
Yeah, well, and what is it that really draws him out of himself? It's his encounter with this woman, one of the wives who's been
rescued.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And
she shows him pity when he fails. Which is, you're worthless unless you serve Immortan Joe's interests.
Yeah.
Well, I think that gets a little bit to, maybe we can start pulling the theology of the body thread, because for the first time he experiences being treated as a subject and not an object. He finally is being treated as an end rather than a means by this wife who, sits back, kind of rests with him, listens to him, talks to him. She's not looking for something from him.
Yeah.
And that's that's what, and by contrast, then that moment when Immortan Joe looked at me like I exist, I matter. That's what he was hungry for the whole time.
Right. The chant before going comic crazy is "witness me,"
Right.
And
I want my life to mean something.
Right. And at the end, it's he acknowledges, he points to this wife and asks her to witness him, and it's her gaze that really encourages him in this
and gives meaning to the sacrifice that he makes of himself.
Right.
Yeah. So the beginning of the film, again, very elegantly, very succinctly, and only visually, we get the sort of an anthropologist tour of Immortan Joe's world. And this is a world that is built on like the opposite of basically John Paul II's culture of death. Like this is a world of instrumentalization. And so let's just go through it. One thing, the wives, the 5 wives that Furiosa rescues are at one point referred to as his prize breeders. And again, it's all implicit, but when you see, what is made clear when you see the crowd of people who are not the wives, plenty of women down there, but they're all kind of mutated and weird. And the thing these 5 wives have in common is that they're perfect. They're like they don't have screwed up genes from whatever nuclear fallout is going on. They are like sort of, pure and unsullied. And that is why Joe wants them to give him children. He's obsessed with the idea of having a son who's not like screwed up like his 2 sons that he does have. So he's using them as like baby incubators. They're not wives in any meaningful sense of the word wife. They're baby makers. Okay, right. Then he's got another room of women who are just milked. They are lactating, and he uses them as cows basically, and he's collecting milk from these women. They're not people to him. They're milk makers. Then there's the war boys who are able-bodied young men and are useful as killing machines, and that's how he uses them. And so he's...
And there's the blood bags, the lowest on the totem pole, right?
That's right, yeah, which is how Max is captured, and they have a doctor with them who's wonderfully named the Organic Mechanic, which is perfect for a world where everything's built around cars. So what's a doctor? Well, he's like a mechanic that works on people, right? So the Organic Mechanic identifies that Max is a type O blood, so he's a universal donor, which makes him a very prized object in the world of Immortan Joe. And so exactly as you say, he's used as an object as well.
Yeah, and there's this emphasis on the body from the very beginning. So we see Max being tattooed on the back with his basically his medical labels, O negative, universal donor. Then almost immediately we cut to our first introduction of Furiosa, and the first thing we see of her is the brand on the back of her neck, the Immortan Joe brand. And same with Nux, when we first encounter him, he's depleted, he's hooked up to a blood bag, just trying to get right again. And so there is this emphasis on the body, which is the sort of uniquely objectifiable element of a person, you know?
Yeah, the brand gets to the whole, it just encompasses the whole philosophy of Immortan Joe, which he says explicitly at some point, that's my child, that's my property, right? And that's his whole point of view. And when when the wives rebel and he bursts into the room where they've been living, what do they have written on the wall? Do you remember?
We are not things.
Exactly. And those are the 2 poles, the philosophical poles here. Are people, means that you can use for whatever end you want, or are they ends in themselves and subjects rather than objects? We are not things is their point of view.
Yeah, well, that thing scribbled on the wall, we are not things, is probably the more memorable of the various things that are scribbled on the wall.
Right.
But
our babies will not be warlords is another, and the other is who killed the world, which we can talk about later.
But our babies will not be warlords is the one that jumped out the most to me. And that really jumped out to me from my very first viewing of the film as being kind of a uniquely pro-life sentiment, that you could frame this as seeking freedom just for yourself. You could frame this as purely a rebellion against the abuse that you've received. But actually the first framing thing that we see, even before we see we are not things, is our babies will not be warlords. And the sort of emphasis on the children, both from Immortan Joe's perspective, but also from the perspective of the wives, who are in sort of various states of pregnancy, really jumps out as being something like it's not a theme that you often encounter in a film that's made in the 2000s. You know, like so
it's interesting too that it's the children who let them up when they return.
Sure.
To the Citadel at the end.
Sure. So I guess one of the reasons I bring that up, aside from like the sort of pro-life interest, is that there's also this element of looking forward to the future and to hope and to what children represent, you know? And I think that if our main characters are sort of stepping out of themselves and sort of, laying down their lives for another person, the wives do that from the beginning in leaving for the sake of their children.
Right, and it gets to another interesting connection to theology of the body, at least from my point of view. When the movie came out, I don't know if you recall, but a lot of the discussion about the film was saying it's a feminist action film.
Yes.
And I'm in some ways, like, I'll say this: the discourse was this is an anti-patriarchy. Like, Immortan Joe stands for whatever, the church, the government, like all these patriarchal supposedly institutions, and Furiosa is the feminist, like, person that shatters that. And I think, like, actually in some ways it's true, but it's not deep enough, because yes, like, she is a woman who is victorious over this bad society, and the society is patriarchal in the sense that Immortan Joe is in charge of it, but it's a false masculinity,
right? And
that's what we start to see. To me, the film wasn't so much feminist. It wasn't about a woman kicking ass. It was about the complementarity of Max and Furiosa.
Absolutely.
Well, this is the question that I came into this wanting to discuss, and it will work well with your theology of the body theme, is like, to what extent is this film a feminist message movie? To what extent does it complicate that?
Well, and I would say John Paul II in some ways could be described as a feminist. He spent a lot of his teaching talking about the sort of the mystery and the genius, the feminine genius, and like what. And I can't read. I'm very hazy. And by the way, I'm not a theologian, but but I just refreshed myself this morning on some of the, theology of the body was teased out over a course of live sermons or general audiences. That's right. So you kind of look at these one by one. I don't think he ever published it as a book himself. I'm sure it's available now as a book, but one of the subjects is like the feminine identity is found in motherhood, and he says that even for women who never become biological mothers, but it talks about the sort of the feminine identity being most fully realized in the person of Our Lady, which is wouldn't be that surprising of a conclusion for any Catholic theologian. We always seem to always be going there, but of course it's because she is, and but I'm working my way back to your point, James, I promise. But I think that what's so great about Furiosa as a female action character is that she is a feminine action hero. Like her whole motivation, her whole plan is very feminine. It is not a woman doing a masculine action movie.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of those. You can see a lot of female action heroes whose power is that they're strong and they can beat people up. But Furiosa is rescuing women. She is being nurturing. I mean, like, and I don't care if you think that I'm being stereotypical or whatever, you people of YouTube, but but it's like we can talk about the role that the mother and the father play, and the role that the mother plays is nurturing and feeding the child, whereas the father plays a different role, which is supportive of that. And Furiosa's mission is to rescue these women. Those women, their mission is to rescue their children for the future.
And it's interesting because George Miller seems to actually address this head on at a certain point in the film when they finally reach the green place, which of course isn't very green, and it's where the many mothers live, but most of the mothers are gone now, and it's just sort of a remnant remaining. These old sort of battle-hardened women. One of them is talking about how she's killed every person she's ever met in this wasteland, and one of the young wives, who's sort of just getting to know these women, says something to the effect of, I thought you all would be above that somehow. And she the older woman looks at her sort of quizzically. In her eyes, you can see that she's intuiting or understanding her meaning. And what does she do next? She says, "Come here, I'll show you something." She shows her the seeds that she's been carrying with her, the real heirlooms that she plants every chance she gets. So it's like, it's a response it's maybe even like a rebuttal, but it's a confirmation of what that younger woman was intuiting, which is our role is different. We are above that, so to speak, you know? Mm-hmm. And I think that like, you know, this is a common criticism of you know, anybody who like begins to espouse like sexual difference is that like women get placed on a pedestal or whatever. But like, okay, they actually kind of are. And if we're going to talk about the Blessed Mother, like she is like our race's solitary boast, right? I think that women really shine forth in this film as being like above the sort of like petty squabbling and the violence and the struggle for survival that characterizes the men in this film. Totally. And not in a way that like necessarily denigrates men. Like I think that masculinity has its day in this film, you know? But when we first are introduced to the wives, what is it? We see Max sort of saddling up to the truck where they've stopped, and they're rinsing off in the water, and it's like this kind of like you've seen this before in a movie or something, you know, like it's kind of sexualized, it's kind of tastefully done, but they really do sort of like like you're bowled over by the beauty of these creatures in this sort of like wicked wasteland. And how is Max behaving? He can be described as like brutish and animalistic for most of this film, but I think that probably nowhere is that more clear than in this scene, where his whole interaction with them is through a series of gestures and grunts, you know, and if he says anything, it's like just one word, like, water, you know, and he's the one who's bringing violence and bringing like aggression, you know, and to basically disrupt this otherwise idyllic, picturesque moment. So I do think that this is something that George Miller is interested in.
And can I throw in, there's another moment that I think where he hits that on the head as well, where when they get to the many mothers, the Vuvolini, which, you know, is sort of taking the name clearly from the vulva, you know, so that this is a women's society that to the exclusion of men. When they see two men getting off of Furiosa's war rig, they're nervous. And they're like, the men? And she's like, they helped us, you know? And so I think even the Vuvolini are broken in their own way because they have seen like the vices of men and the vices of masculinity. And they've said, well, we don't want that as part of our culture. But Furiosa, who's grown up in a man's world, has also seen the virtues of men and is willing to trust Max and Nux. And so again, like the war party of Furiosa is the integration of masculinity and femininity.
Yeah. I mean, you guys both said like a lot of things there that I want to comment on. One of which is first, because going back to a couple of things you said before about Nux, and I wish I could remember the name of the woman that the redhead is bonding with.
She's I wrote it down. I can't remember.
If we're talking about complementary and solidarity rather than division, I think it's interesting to note that I think the reason that she is able to sympathize with him is that she grew up in that society, and she probably has some kind of strange matriarchal fondness for these war boys. I mean, she probably has some kind of pity despite her disgust with that whole social order. I think she probably has some sympathy for their plight and is in a unique position to understand him, you know. And you were talking about people's bodies being used, and I think that there's also a solidarity between the men and the women in this film in that respect. I mean, despite
they've been victims of
the biggest focus of the plot is on the women not being things and their rescue. But of course, Mad Max is being used as an object from the beginning of the film. He's every bit being used as a resource as they are. And of course, the war boys are being every bit used as objects as they are, as you pointed out. Now,
well, and let me just jump on that because I think with the men, specifically with Nux and Max, they both kind of end the way they started, because Nux sacrifices himself for something, and Max gives his blood. But so like on some objective level, nothing changed. But what's different is that their freedom is now involved. It's a self-gift.
And this is perhaps like the most Catholic aspect of the movie, because a lot of people, let's take the debate over, you know, among Christians over like obedience in marriage, right? Like a lot of people would say, well, like, oh no, obedience is inherently like degrading and unequal. But like, there's such a huge difference between like in any situation, not just marriage. There's such a huge difference between being made into a slave and like choosing like obedience is the ultimate act of freedom, which is I think what John Paul II would think, the ultimate act of freely giving yourself and like the ultimate actualization of the human capacity for freedom, right?
There's this idea.
And so these things, like I was saying with the values of his society being put to some good with Nux, it's the same with Max, as you pointed out. It's the same physical thing, but the dynamic is different and the meaning of it is different. So rather than George Miller saying, well, liberation comes when you just reject that idea of serving anybody but yourself at all. And, I'm so traumatized by this, being used to give blood that I just have to go and, do self-care and live for myself now. He's going back to the same wheelhouse, but it's been totally redeemed and transformed in that way.
Right. So it gets to a really key theology of the body concept, which is the nuptial meaning of the body, which is a phrase probably you guys have come across and everything. Yeah. And so it means, nuptials is when people marry, and John Paul means it in that sense, as well as a deeper sense too. But in that sense, what it means is in a way, like the male genitalia do not make sense unless there are also female genitalia out there. And what that means is that you can read the body and see that the body is there to be given as a gift to another. The body is incomplete on its own. And he really interestingly points out that the first sign of something not being right in Genesis is when God sees that Adam is alone and sees that that's not good. Everything up to this point has been good, but Adam's original solitude is not good. And in that, for that reason, he has to make him a helper, one of flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood, etc. But the deeper sense of the nuptial meaning of the body is just simply that the body is there so that we subjects can make a gift of ourselves to each other. And in this sense, it's quite striking to think about the fact that any interaction my soul can have with your soul or the souls of the people listening to us is, in the words of one of my favorite science fiction stories, only accomplished because I'm squeezing air through my meat. Like the articulation of my inner thoughts into words that you can understand is through this physical medium of my body. And it's true about the sacraments as well, that all of the sacraments have that physical embodied component. You put the Eucharist on your tongue, the priest speaks the words of absolution with his meat. He squeezes air through his meat in order to forgive your spiritual sins. It's kind of amazing. So the sacraments are maybe it's kind of the biggest exemplar of the nuptial meaning of the body, in the sense that the body is used to administer the grace of God. But it's true in all human interactions that we use our bodies, even if it's just simply speech or the look between someone's eyes, we use our bodies in order to make ourselves a gift to each other. And the films focus on the body as a medium of gift
rather than on dialogue.
Right.
Yeah.
Is very much in line with that.
Yeah. So a couple other things I wanted to go back to is like, okay, so, you could look at this as clearly somewhat intentionally a feminist movie. I'm not a feminist, so like that potentially poses a problem for me, right? So, but I do see that it complicates it in various ways. You already pointed that out with the many mothers to a certain extent, but like, okay, George Miller, he hires, I think Eve Ensler is her name, the author of the Vagina Monologues, as a consultant, as a script consultant on this film. So like, there's a clear like feminist genealogy, right? But and then you've got that word breeders. It's like, yes, in the context of this film, obviously that's wrong, but it can't help for a pro-life Catholic call to mind the sorts of slurs that are cast at pro-life people. You think that women are just for breeding and, handmaids.
But
and
isn't
all
it
that
fair
kind
to
of
say
stuff.
that if that's what Catholics thought, it would be wrong?
Yes,
that's
what I'm saying. But it still feels like it can bring forth those connotations, right? Of like
it's open to that interpretation. It's open to like a certain cheerleader. Yes.
This is one of the things that disappointed me the most about how this film was originally received, was as being this sort of like feminist anthem or something, but that really like flatlines the film and like robs it of a lot of its complexity. I remember getting into an argument with a priest friend about this because he just was completely dismissive of this movie because he just didn't want to see another movie where like men were muzzled and thrown on the front of a car and that like the woman saves the day,
right?
You know, but like the thing is,
what are the other movies like?
no, but like I bring that up as an example of how this film was bandied about. It was like, oh yeah, Mad Max is like no, totally helpless.
So
and
it's like you're saying like people on the left were like, yeah, this is like a leftist screen, and then people on the right were like, I'm not interested because it's leftist. And it's you guys are missing it.
I remember some people actually like celebrating the fact that the main character is within the first moments of the film captured and like bound and muzzled, you know, and so it, like in this era of like mansplaining or whatever, it's like so refreshing to see like Mad Max, like, but that I don't think that that's really what's going on there. You know?
It's only if you take that as like just an isolated image. That,
exactly.
But so, okay, the other big thing, the big thing at the beginning is like, who killed the world, right? And then that's said by a character later. You know, there's this back and forth between Nux and one of the wives, and Nux says, you're killing everyone and everything. Nux says, we're not to blame. Then who killed the world? Then she kicks him out of the car. Who killed the world? That's obviously like a very like facile thing in a sense, but you know, looking at it in terms of the battle of the sexes, who's probably in charge of the war efforts and the things that destroyed the world? Probably mostly men.
Is that how you interpret that exchange? I always thought that this was a discussion about like people's, just humanity's role in the destruction of the environment.
That's interesting. I always took it as men, and that's why they're going off to the many mothers, and it's a society of all women. Now the film complicates this, so I'm not saying that the film is totally endorsing this,
right?
But I think that the framework that's set up, who killed the world, this patriarchal, militaristic society, and then we're going to go to the green place with the many mothers in this nurturing place. So from the very beginning, it's not the type of feminism that is girl boss or women are just totally imitating men, but there is a kind of like, perhaps like 1970s, you know, lesbian folk music aspect to it, where like we don't need men, we're going to go make this nurturing society. And then what do we see? I've killed every person I've met out here. I thought you girls were above that somehow. And it shows you that like, okay, like, well, to paraphrase whoever said that, you know, if God didn't exist, we'd have to invent him. If men didn't exist, we'd have to invent them, because somebody needs to be the protector in a hard and fallen world. It's clear that like, well, okay, if you don't have any men in this society, then women are just going to end up being, as you say, broken in by having to, you know, so that's the biggest complicating scene, as you pointed out.
Yeah, and the green place too is spoiled. You know that the
not that it's their fault per se, but
going back to that exchange, I always thought, and I mean, I think you might be right. Or put it this way: the text doesn't tell us, and we could ask George Miller what he thinks, but in a way, who cares, right? Because if that exchange, if we read it the other way, which is when Nux says we're not to blame, he means we people are not to blame. What I glean from that is that that's part of the Gospel of Immortan Joe. The world is broken, but we are not to blame. It's not your fault, you know. And so I think he's preaching a certain like.
So Nux is saying we're not to blame, inclusive of the women he's talking to,
right? And she's saying, she's trying to puncture his myth and say, then who killed the world? Like, look around
Human
us,
beings
like
killed the
we
world.
did this.
Yeah,
that's very interesting. I always thought of that as like a gendered thing.
Well, I think that's another element that's present in this film that doesn't really get worked on in the previous films, is like this religious element, you know, like, because I think that with each film, George Miller explores like a sort of a different aspect of society that begins to rebound or come back in the wake of like some sort of cataclysmic ending of society. So if in the first film, maybe it's like a sense of judicial like law and order and then execution of justice. Then in the second film, you know, maybe it's just society at all, you know, like having your little encampment and protecting it from the raiders. If the third film, society is like a little more sophisticated, and now there's like other rituals that begin to enter in, things that bind the group together. There's a clear hierarchy. Well, in the fourth film, like there's this religious element that emerges with Immortan Joe, not just sitting at the top of this hierarchy in a sort of judicial or governmental sense, but also in this sort of salvific he describes himself as,
I am your redeemer.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so if we're talking about redemption being a major theme of this film, where is redemption found? Well, at the beginning, we're told that it's found in Immortan Joe and in this society that he's constructed, and this sort of pseudo-religious. Well, because they're all making these gestures what do they say? Like, I honor you or something. Or
V8, I honor him with my deeds.
Yeah,
As though V8 is like this heroic man from the mythical past.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and all this talk about the afterlife and Valhalla and all of, like, I'll ride immortal. I see the whole Mad Max series as like a sort of investigation into these aspects of like what makes us human,
what builds a society, like how our society is structured.
And in Fury Road, which is, as an aside, I would be surprised if there ever was another Mad Max film proper. I understand that they're making some sort of Furiosa prequel maybe, but like it does seem that like with Fury Road, George Miller sort of reaches the zenith of like what can be investigated in this post-apocalyptic world in terms of this progressive analysis of a society trying to put itself back together, because now we're arriving at like,
at least in the format of an action movie.
Yeah.
Well, I hope there's 5 more of these personally.
Cool. But I'm just bringing up the religion aspect,
right,
because
right.
that line, "Who killed the world?" It punctures. Well, I mean, it gets to something of like an original sin. This is fallen man. Trying to like understand like how we got here.
Right.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I never thought of a broader reading of that.
I wanted to talk about the way that George Miller portrays feminine action heroes, because I mentioned earlier that it's different from just beat you up, and I talked about the fact that Furiosa's mission is nurturing, but I think it's also interesting how she executes her plan, because it is not based on I'm bigger and stronger and I'm going to be able to beat up these people that I know are going to be pursuing me. She does it through diplomacy. She makes a lot of deals. She makes deals with those guys and they're going to attack these people for me. And then she sees Max, and much quicker than he trusts her, she trusts him, and she gives him the code to drive the car.
That's a good point.
She says,
That's
sit there.
Point, yeah.
She lets him hold the gun. She lets him collect the guns. She is very trusting because part of her skill set is trusting people. And Max is much, much slower to do that. He won't even tell her his name. He's obviously collecting the guns. And I think she recognizes the humanity in the same way that the redhead recognized the humanity in Nux. She recognizes the humanity in Max when she's trying to negotiate, move over and let me drive this car, because if you don't, we're all going to die. When she finally figures out what convinces him, do you remember what she says?
Oh, yeah, right.
You want that thing off your face, and then he just turns, and it's like, yes, I do, because like all of the other things in some ways were more practical, but she knows that the thing that's most offensive to Max is the loss of his freedom, and that's why like he's willing to get his hair cut, he's willing to get the tattoos, but when they brand him as Immortan Joe's property, that's when it's like, oh hell no, and he does his like crazy rampage. That's the one that's a bridge too far, because I'm not anyone's property.
Right.
There's like that inner, despite how broken and beast-like he is, he knows like that's beneath me,
Yeah. I wanted to, bring up the question of like, why does Furiosa work as an action hero? Because obviously, the context of this discussion is all these stupid movies with female action heroes who are totally unrealistic in their ability to fight men. And, Charlize Theron is
I will say she definitely could beat me up, but that's not what we're talking about. Right. Yeah.
Charlize Theron is pretty slender. It's not like she's like Gina Carano in The Mandalorian, where she's actually like a big muscle-bound woman. And so I wouldn't say it's real. The fight between her and Mad Max is like totally realistic. Now he does have some disadvantages in that fight, but I think there's ways in which it works. I mean, something you've suggested to me in the past, James, is that simply something as simple of a gesture as her shaving her head. It's at least it's not that it makes her look like she's physically stronger, but it just is a symbolic gesture rather than a realistic one of like, okay, this is a woman who has learned some
learn to live in a man's world.
Yeah. It's like a signifier, and I think that like our ability to suspend disbelief and to like find these characters, these female action heroes, like palatable, you know, like to be able to receive that, and I don't just mean it like receive it like, you know, dutifully or obediently or ideologically. I mean like really buy it and really like embrace it fully. I think that like it certainly helps when something of the character's femininity is sacrificed, you know, and so I think that that this shaving of her head and like, you know, the like obscuring of her face with this black makeup, you know, like that helps me to like buy into it. But certainly too, Charlize Theron, like her portrayal of this character and also like something of her personality is super tough, you know, like super believable in this. And so I never found that an issue. Even in that,
you know, on this viewing, something occurred to me that I found kind of interesting. She, like the wives, is not screwed up and all irradiated and tumory and everything. So why isn't she a wife, right? Because you get the sense that she and her mother were captured early on.
Right.
I'm sure that's going to be explored in the prequel.
I think so too, but this time around, it made me wonder, maybe she is sterile. Maybe for some reason she's infertile or something, and so she's useless as a wife. And that may... I just thought that, at least to me on this viewing, it enriched the story of her taking care of these young women who she's kind of adopted.
I think she has to have been like at least a potential wife in the past, you know.
But that's a really interesting reading because, you know, like theology of the body, as John Paul II describes, like whether we become mothers or fathers at all is it's irrelevant. Our purpose is to be a mother or a father in some way, to like act out this vocation of our body.
Right.
And so if she's sterile, then that's like a very rich opportunity to sort of examine this capacity that she nevertheless still has to be
she's
a mother.
Still a mother, right?
Yeah, you know. And same for Max for that matter. You know, this is a man whose wife and child were killed in the first film, but he continues to act out this.
Well, there's nothing more dad-like in this movie than when he comes back after off-screen totally effing up the bullet farmer. Yeah. And he comes back like with a duffel bag full of stuff. And it's like, that's like dad coming home from work. He's wiping the blood off his face. And he's like, hey kids, here, I got a boot for you.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah. But there is something like just so interestingly symbolic about this woman just driving this giant rig full of breast milk through this like arid wasteland. You know?
Right. That's fascinating.
Every once in a while,
when you think of it in the big picture, like
every once in a while, I would just remind myself as all these explosions are happening and all this violence and action, like that is just a giant truck filled with breast milk, and Charlize Theron is just barreling across like the arid waste. You know?
That's fascinating. Yeah. So back to the point about her using diplomacy. Do you think that part of the reason that she's better at that than Max, like also again points to like the benefits of living in a society, even one as twisted as Immortan Joe's, in that Max hasn't been living in a society. He's been wandering around and he's becoming more and more insane. Whereas all these people are broken people in various ways, but they are she knows
what motivates people. Yeah. That's like clearly what she's good at, right? So she's like, hey, you motorcycle guys up here with your bare feet and your campfires, I got a big sphere of gasoline that's just for you if you blow up the whatever, you know, and help me do this, right? And then with Max, it's the thing, and then it's like, where else does she show that? Another thing I noticed though about the other women warriors in this, the Vuvolini, their weapon is deceit. You know, it's not strength of arms. And actually when they're again, like, so to your point about, so George Miller brought in Vagina Monologues Lady, and I'm not opposed, you know, necessarily to that either, because I don't know her or her work or philosophy, but I will say that regardless of his influences, he's clearly committed enough to the truth that he's willing to be honest about things. And just for example, there's a point where Rictus, the big roided out son of Immortan Joe, is manhandling one of the wives. I can't remember which one he's grabbing to carry into Joe's truck, but one of the Vuvolini women warriors sees that and goes, rah! And she shows a lot of valor and fortitude and bravery, but he makes short work.
Yeah,
of
I
it.
noticed that in
He
this
just
one,
chucks
too.
it right off the truck. So in a Marvel movie, there would have been at least some exchange of blows, but she doesn't even get a punch in. He's just
Right.
like, whoop, there you go.
Yeah.
So and so I think he's a serious enough artist that he's like committed to doing the true version of the story,
too.
you know?
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to bring up is like the eye of the camera in this movie, because I mean, you alluded to I think the first Mad Max movie it's got like a rape scene right at the beginning, and it is careless. I think maybe the first two are like this, but definitely the first one, they're kind of careless, much in the way that like a lot of like 70s or like early 80s movies are in the use of the female body, because it's like, oh, we can show nudity in films now, and so we're gonna just do it in like a very careless way, where even like Airplane has like random nudity in it, you know. And I think that, I mean, there's immodest dress in this movie, right? But like, I think there's something like very chaste about the camera in the film. I would say this and Thunderdome are like the most chaste of the series. At least I don't remember the second one as well. But so like, what is that? Like you mentioned the scene where we first see like all the wives together, and Mad Max is sort of like taken aback at this, like, it's like a mirage in the desert, almost, right? And they're these beautiful women, scantily clad. They're all, most of the actresses are models. Yeah. You know, hosing each other down. And you said like, yeah, we've seen this before, right? Because it could be because it could be like, you know, a Playboy thing or something. And yet something, I don't know what it is about the camera that like it doesn't. I wouldn't say like I don't exercise any custody of the eyes when watching that scene, but there is something about the intent of the camera that seems pure.
Yeah.
Like it also seems like he's taking that, like so many other things in the movies, he's taking that imagery and like repurposing it in a way. I guess, because it really is about like the feminine beauty, and like in the context of the film where it's more about just like femininity, period. Because like that's the only femininity we're seeing in the film.
Well, and isn't there, maybe there's part of it is that when you see those, like the car wash scene from the high school movie or whatever, there's something where the way the women act is as though they are not agents, but that they are objects. And maybe here, like these characters are pursuing their goals, and you know what they're doing is clipping off those chastity belts that Joe has put on them, you know, and they're washing off the dust. Like there is a real logic to their behavior, and they're not just like whipping their blonde hair around. Which,
right.
You know,
do you think there was anything about like the camera like work itself on that though that like makes it less exploitative?
The shot that wasn't there is the shot that starts on the feet and goes up to the face, you know, and so he doesn't do that. He does what he does is it's a focus pull, and that's what gives you this sense of like a developing image where it's like, what am I seeing here? You know, it's like, in other words, it's out of focus and then it sharpens.
And later when we're first introduced to the Vuvolini and there's this bait who's naked, even that is shot in a way that sort of preserves, you know, there's not a lingering on or zooming in on anything. And it's also the way that the violence is handled. So even though this is a film that's like chock full of violence, that chastity is still intact. For instance, when Immortan Joe, spoiler alert, finally dies in this very gruesome way, the camera is mercifully away from his face for most of that, you know, and then when it comes back to this interaction between him and the wife who's sitting next to him, well, I mean, he's dead, but she like, you know, spits on him or something. He's not even in the frame. So it's like there's this chaste restraint, not just in areas of sexuality, but also in violence that I think is very appropriate given the themes of the film.
There's something interesting about. There's a relative of my family who, I guess I've heard the story. He saw there was a little girl as he was growing up. He knew her. She was across the street, and then he saw her get hit by a car and was killed. And the memory apparently is that he saw her reduced to this bag of guts. Like suddenly she's split open and she was not a person anymore. And she was, and I hate to tell that story, but it actually is to my point, which is that both nudity and a horrible sort of like mangling of the body take away the they kind of like put a wall between you and the soul that was there in the body. They make the body an object, like just purely flesh. You know?
John Paul II talks about this sort of healthy shame that comes as a result of the fall, which is a protection. I understand that my body can be now objectified and used. Right. And so this healthy shame or this modesty comes as a way of protecting that integrity, that
right. And the famous quote, I hope he said this, but if not, it's one of those internet quotes that's kind of true. But what am I thinking? It's the problem with pornography is not that it shows too much, but that it shows too little. In other words, it hides the person.
Sure.
I think that's maybe more of a Christopher West
like sort of digestion of theology body.
Something is actually now occurring to me, an interesting parallel, whereas at the beginning of the film, we have Mad Max strapped to the front of this car, just like fully exposed to the elements and the ricochets and the sandstorm.
Good. I know where you're going with this.
Well, at the end, Immortan Joe is on the front of the car.
Dude, that's such a good point.
Well, let me make the point.
Sorry.
He's shrouded. He's covered, right? His body is covered, and they only expose it at the end when they really have to. Mm-hmm. So it's like it is this interesting.
Well, there's another one which is the milking mothers, the people who are lactating and he's milking them. When they come and they turn on the fountain of water at the very end, they are clothed because they, again, to your point, like they know I can't go out there like this. Yeah. I will be only seen for what my body's good for. That's interesting. To clothe myself.
Yeah, because it is these mothers, these milking mothers who come and release the water at the end, and it waters the land and all of the people.
If there's a single shot that I don't feel great about, it is the first shot of the milking mothers, because I get it's intended. I get that it's intended to be grotesque, but there is something that, like, when you show like things intended to be grotesque or bad in movies, like there is still a danger of just like offending human dignity just by like showing it, and like there's something about that like I don't really like, but obviously I understand the intent,
It's like, how do you? It's a tricky thing for an artist. How do you show a woman who's being objectified without inviting your audience to do the exact same thing that the bad guys?
Right. It's not that we're being invited to. It's not that it's like a temptation to lust per se, but it's simply just like the
right. I get it. One thing I want to say in connection to that, and this maybe takes us in a different direction, is that I think that one of the things that's sort of reassuring to me in these moments is the really expert sense of visual storytelling that exists throughout this film. So that's something that we've mentioned already in these action sequences that are actually advancing the story. They're supremely legible. It's amazing how much information is conveyed, not just in terms of like narrative or character development, but even just in the logistics of the fight itself. I'm like able, in all of this chaos, to track like so many different movements and interactions, and I feel very taken care of by the camera.
You can contrast very easily with like the Batman movies, the Christian Bale Batman movies, and I'm sure it was a deliberate choice to confuse us, but you can't see frickin' anything when Batman's beating someone. It's just like, this is the camera,
Sure, yeah, but so that legibility, that intentness and clarity, I think, makes me feel very taken care of, not just through these really chaotic action sequences, but also everywhere else, where the intent of the camera is much clearer.
Like if it's on screen, it's supposed to be. You're supposed to, we're doing something with this.
Right. And there's other elements that are being leveraged, whether it's the editing or the sound, the music, to clarify that intent for me too.
That feeling that you're having is the feeling. Have you ever read a novel where you're just spinning your wheels? Like, these are words for the sake of words, and then you read something that has this like real poetic terseness where like every word is here because it has to be, and every word is doing work.
Right.
And this movie has that latter quality where like everything is doing work here. It's like an epic poem.
Definitely. And that's true not just in the visuals, but also in the sound, I think. The sound design in this is really great, but also the use of music, and also, I'll say, the use of silence. I think that that George Miller and whoever else worked on editing this film really exemplifies like an expert use of pacing and of silence. It's those spaces of rest that really accentuate the moments of activity and noise. And I think that, you might be tempted to describe this as a film of just nonstop action, but actually, even within those action sequences, George Miller is constantly finding moments of rest, moments of quiet before, boom, it launches back out into something else. So bullets might be flying overhead, but we have like a quiet moment with
like Max towards the end gets that arrow stuck in his head, and there's a moment where we're just with him, like, whoa, what just happened? And it's a pause, it's a breath, and we're back into it.
Totally, and there's this musicality to the film as a whole, where we're really brought on this ride, like through all these different movements, these musical movements, but there's this awareness that for every crescendo there needs to be this moment of rest.
Well, you pointed out as we were watching, Tim, that the 4-part structure of the movie, where it's like divided on the half hour.
One of the many times that I've watched this movie, I watched it with a pause button, and I was checking the time code at all of these beats, and basically I made a list for myself. But the film breaks down into 4 half hours. It's exactly 2 hours long, and the 4 chunks, each a half hour long. It's just this 4-act movie, and the first time we fade to black is 30 minutes. :00 into the movie, and then again when spoiler alert, when
Splendid is their
Splendid
name,
Angharad falls under the wheels, and that's basically the end of that second pursuit. That's at 1 hour into the movie. Then you have the thing that happens at night and meeting the Vuvolini, but when it's like, let's go back out there, and we cut to a Morton Joe, he's like playing this weird maraca or something, and there's the war rig on the horizon. That's an hour and a half into.
So you compare the third act, which is the slow story, sort of dialogue act, that being the lento movement, in a symphony or something, which I thought was cool. We haven't talked about the very end of the film yet, and that's the part where you could maybe does the weight of the film fall on the feminist side? So Max does not stay; they go back to the Citadel, and at the very end, Max leaves, and we see his face, leaving through the crowd. And then the last shot of the film is from below. We're seeing all the women being raised up on this elevator.
Lifted up on a pedestal.
Yeah. They're being raised up on this elevator. And there are men on the elevator too. And they're obviously men up in the Citadel that they're going to have to work with. But the final shot is like, we're looking from below, we're going, and their faces are covered up by the platform that they're standing on. So okay, that's an imagery that's clearly you could say that's a feminist image, but what I want to know on a character level is okay, so why doesn't Max?
But I think that gets down to just
the
very basic conception of this character, which is that he's like Shane from the Westerns, or he's like this Western guy who's like the kind of the hero with no name who wanders into a town that's got a problem, and when it's done, he's just cursed to wander back out and seek another adventure.
I agree. So I agree that it's tootally consonant with the character, but does this pose a problem for the balance between the masculine and feminine elements in the movie? Well, I guess it doesn't. Are they just going to create this matriarchy now?
It feels like the alternative is what, sort of essentially, maybe not exactly romantically, but Max and Furiosa are like mom and dad of this new culture, and it just doesn't feel in character for Max. What Max's journey was going from basically Adam's original solitude of the only man, a man alone with no community, no society, being kind of called back into community actually by the ghosts who said you left us, and really he's leaving everybody, not just the dead. But by the end, he has given of himself, made a gift of himself to Furiosa. He's helped build this society. And I think he's gotten the redemption that he needed at the beginning. It's not, his vocation was never to be
the new leader of this society. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And
whereas Furiosa, in some ways, she has always been a leader of these people. They look to her, they admire her. And so it's right and good that she should,
And I think that it's it's how we can have our cake and eat it too. Max needs to die, basically. Max needs to self-immolate. He needs to give of himself. And so, but we don't want him to actually die. So this is how that's accomplished. Is he doesn't remain to receive the honor or the glory or the rewards. That he did this totally selflessly, and now he's off ostensibly to go help somebody else.
Right.
So I think that something that occurs to me too is even if they are going to now be at the head of this new society, well, it's not going to be a straight matriarchy. Like, men are going to be a part of that.
Yeah.
And that's actually part of I think the character arc for Furiosa and for the lot of them,
for the wives too.
Yeah. It's actually Max's doing, because what were they going to do? They were going to do just what Max has been doing. They were just going to get on their bikes and just ride,
right?
And just ride out into the waste and just keep going, and he knows from experience that out that way is nothing.
So maybe the movie is upholding sex difference even at the very end, because Max is going out there and the women are going back home.
Oh, yeah, well,
an enclosed citadel.
But he does convince them. He is the one who impresses upon Furiosa that redemption is back that way, back at the Citadel where like society is, and it's this need for society that really like comes to bear there, and it's Max who is the instrument of that.
Yeah, and Furiosa. Yeah, I never read it as an arc, but you're totally right. Her plan from the beginning is to go out and live among the ladies.
Yeah.
Right? But over the course of the adventure, of course, she sees the kind of the virtues of these two men that join up. By the end, when they return, they're going back to a place that was built by Immortan Joe. And she has this faith in the possibility of someone like Max to do good. And I think what's interesting there is like she says, he says, what are you looking for? And she says, redemption.
Yeah.
Right? Which means that she herself is someone, she's doing this because she feels really bad about something she's done in the past, you know?
Right.
And so she's got faith in the ability of people to change and to become good. And so I think that she's coming back in a way to redeem the Citadel,
I think the character of Nux helps us to believe that like maybe there's some way forward here, that like these guys can,
the war boys can be
learn
integrated.
a new way of being somehow.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that the gaze that's shared between the two of them at the end, as Furiosa is being lifted up into the Citadel and Max is receding into the crowd, I think that speaks more eloquently.
There's like a gaze of like mutual confidence.
Exactly. Exactly. So it's because so much of the problem about sex relations nowadays, or the way we conceive of men and women, is because we're conceived of as primarily existing in this power struggle, in this sort of combative relationship, and not something of essential complementarity and cooperation. And that's where we find these characters at the beginning, where it is just power struggle, it is just dog eat dog, there is no trust, and so everybody's working against one another, even when they are one another's salvation, basically. They are one another's redemption. And so it's this discovery of this capacity for trust and for cooperation that really rescues everybody. Rescues not just these characters, but the whole world in which they exist. It's what changes the world. So, dude, this movie's awesome.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. I've watched it, I don't know, 6 or 7 times, I'm sure. And it's easy to watch things passively, but then when you sit down and have like a deliberate 80-minute conversation about a movie, it's like amazing like how much that like unlocks, that you didn't see even in several viewings,
Right.
Yeah, that's great.
It is the greatest Catholic action movie ever made, at least so far. Probably unbeknownst to George Miller, the director. So,
well, one can only hope.
Yeah.
Shaun of the Dead is the second.
Well, cool. Well, thanks a lot, Tim, for getting on the show with us again to talk about this movie. I'm so glad that we did this. I don't know that we'll have to do separate episodes on the other Mad Max films, because we touched on them enough. But certainly
we'll have to review the prequel.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, when
for sure.
Furiosa comes out?
Yeah, probably. Who knows? Maybe we'll have you back on there to talk about that. But yeah, is there anything else that we want to say?
Well, Thomas, you touched on this. I'll just mention that Babe is a masterpiece of a totally other kind.
I haven't seen it since I was little.
It is still so good. It's like it speaks to the child and every adult flawlessly.
What about Babe 2?
One of the weirdest movies I've ever seen. Super weird. Like there is a part where a dog nearly drowns as it's dragged by its leash into the water and Babe the pig has to save it, but like there's a real solid like 20 seconds where a dog is drowning in the water. So it's and then another like 15-minute sequence where a woman is bouncing around on super stretchy suspenders. It's not a good movie. It's definitely worth a watch though. But Babe is a masterpiece.
What about Happy Feet? Is that any good?
I don't think so, but it's funny. Like George Miller to me is one of the greatest artists working in film, but he hasn't made consistently good movies necessarily, but the movies that are great are some of the greatest ever. And I think this, Mad Max, and Babe are some of the best ever.
Well, we'll just have to watch Babe and talk about that. Yeah.
Although, interestingly, he only produced it and didn't direct, although there's some discussion that, it was a protege of his that directed, and similar to people saying like kind of Spielberg kind of directed Poltergeist.
Right.
That's the rumor about Babe as well.
I thought he was the director. Yeah.
But I would call him the author of the film, whether he was the credited director or not. But anyway, he's definitely someone that's always interesting to watch, even when he's not making a great movie.
Yeah.
So,
did you see the most recent one?
My brother saw it and said it's in the category of Babe 2 Pig in the City. So
it sounded like very filthy from the descriptions that I heard, so I didn't end up seeing it for that reason.
I think I haven't seen it, so I won't give an opinion. But my brother said it's not on the level of Babe or Mad Max Fury Road. So yeah.
Well, enough said about Babe. Thanks everybody for listening. If you got this far, please give us a like, a subscribe, like on whatever format you're listening or watching. The next film, we're going from one great auteur to another. I think the next film we'll be discussing is Tarkovsky's The Sacrifice.
Correct. Back to the Vatican film list.
Yeah, we're really trying to get that one done.
And we'll see you next time.